19 ayes, 31 noes. This bill has been defeated. No, please stay quiet in gallery. Thank you. All right, do we have author motions? Is there consent to take these in one motion? All right, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion's passed. All right, is there any other further business? Is there other further business to come before the Senate? Is there any other further business to come before the Senate? Senator Bray is recognized for a motion to adjourn.
You just watched less than 60 seconds of procedural theater that exposes the entire rotting infrastructure of American democracy. And if your blood isn't already boiling, then you haven't been paying attention, because what we're witnessing right here, right now, in this seemingly mundane chamber moment is nothing less than the architectural blueprint of minority rule, dressed up in parliamentary formality. And I need you to understand that this isn't just some obscure legislative machination or inside baseball political nonsense. This is the exact moment when Republican senators, who have spent years genuflecting at Trump's altar, suddenly remembered that maybe, just maybe, turning the entire democratic process into a rigged casino where only their side can win might actually blow up in their faces spectacularly. After the Supreme Court's conservative majority ruled in favor of Texas lawmakers last week, Republicans head into the 2026 election year with an edge in the redistricting fight kicked off by President Trump, with the court allowing Republicans' new congressional map to move ahead, despite a lower court finding that the Texas legislature had likely conducted a racial gerrymander, with the map potentially yielding 5 more seats for the GOP. And wait, because it gets so much worse and so much better simultaneously, depending on whether you believe in cosmic justice or just pure political chaos. In July, President Donald Trump ordered Texas Gov. Greg Abbott to redistrict his state in the middle of the decade in order to carve out an additional 5 Republican-leaning congressional districts, which would bolster the party's odds of keeping control of the U.S. House of Representatives following the 2026 midterm elections. Think about the audacity of that statement, the sheer authoritarian brazenness of a president ordering states to redraw their maps mid-decade, which violates over a century of democratic norms, all because President Trump's demands for gerrymandering correlate with his record-low approval rating and the rising unpopularity of his signature legislation. This is a man so terrified of actual democratic accountability that he's literally trying to redraw reality itself to avoid the consequences of his catastrophic governance. And here's where it becomes absolutely vital that you grasp the full Machiavellian genius and simultaneous stupidity of this gambit. Because Trump essentially looked at the 2026 midterms, saw the electoral bloodbath coming for Republicans, and decided that rather than governing competently or offering popular policies, he would simply eliminate competitive districts wholesale through the most egregious gerrymandering scheme in modern American history. Some Republican lawmakers noted the push was coming from outside Indiana and said their constituents did not support mid-cycle redistricting, with a November poll finding that 90% of Indiana Republican voters surveyed viewed Trump favorably, but only 53% approved of the redistricting. Let that penetrate your consciousness for a moment, because even in deep red Indiana, where Trump won nearly 59% of the vote, his own voters don't support this naked power grab, which tells you everything about how transparently corrupt and anti-democratic this entire enterprise is. And yet here we are watching Republican legislators wrestle with their consciences on live television, knowing full well that opposing Trump means Trump and his allies amped up the pressure, even calling out undecided lawmakers on social media, threatening primary challenges and withholding funding from their districts, with some lawmakers receiving threats of violence or reporting their homes or businesses being swatted. This is political terrorism dressed in MAGA regalia, and the fact that it's happening in broad daylight with zero pretense of democratic legitimacy should terrify every single person who claims to care about representative government. Now the genius of what you're watching in this clip is that it captures the precise moment when the facade cracks, because what Trump didn't anticipate was that some Republicans would actually balk at the most extreme version of his gerrymandering scheme, not out of principle necessarily, but out of raw political calculation and self-preservation, and you can see it in the speed of that adjournment motion, the way they rush through the vote and immediately scatter like roaches when the lights come on, because they know that what they're doing is profoundly unpopular, even among their own constituents, and they don't want to be on record defending the indefensible. The Brennan Center estimates that this gerrymandering will give Republicans an advantage of around 16 House seats in the 2024 race to control Congress, compared to fair maps. 16 seats. That's the margin between majority and minority control, between democratic accountability and autocratic entrenchment, between a functioning republic and a performative democracy where the outcomes are predetermined before a single ballot is cast. And here's what makes this particular moment so explosively significant, beyond just this one vote, because at this point, it appears the redistricting battle could tilt about 12 or 14 seats toward Republicans and Democrats, could counter with around 9 seats pushed their way. But that all depends on the outcome of pending court challenges and state legislative votes, with a lot still in play. What a lot still in play. Trump has done is unleash an arms race of gerrymandering that threatens to completely destroy whatever remaining legitimacy our electoral system possesses, and you need to understand the historical parallel here, because this is exactly how democracies die, not with tanks in the streets, but with maps redrawn in windowless rooms by politicians who have decided that maintaining power is more important than maintaining democracy itself. Think about the Weimar Republic. Think about Hungary under Orbán. Think about every single instance where a political faction realized it couldn't win fair elections and decided to rig the game instead, and you're watching it happen in real time on the floor of an American legislative chamber. The sheer cynicism is breathtaking, but what's even more breathtaking is the incompetence, because after a federal court panel struck down Republicans' new map in Texas on Tuesday, the entire exercise holds the potential to net Democrats more winnable seats in the House instead, with Trump potentially having let the genie out of the bottle, but not getting the wish he'd hoped for. California responded with its own counter-gerrymander that could neutralize Texas entirely, and suddenly Republicans are discovering that when you demolish democratic norms, those norms can't protect you either, and Democrats might just be willing to fight fire with napalm. This is the paradox of authoritarian overreach that Trump in his infinite narcissistic short-sightedness never considered, which is that when you tell your opponents that the gloves are off, they might actually take you seriously and start throwing haymakers. When Trump began demanding Republican-controlled states engage in rare mid-decade redistricting, Texas, Missouri, and North Carolina quickly caved, and they have since passed new maps that, taken together, could eliminate a total of 7 congressional seats held by Democrats in each case at the expense of minority voters, with Indiana's proposed map potentially climbing that number to 9 GOP pickups. At the expense of minority voters. This isn't just about partisan advantage. This is about racial gerrymandering on a scale we haven't seen since the Jim Crow era, and the fact that the Supreme Court's conservative supermajority is enabling this through shadow docket rulings that overturn lower court findings of racial gerrymandering tells you everything about how the entire federal judiciary has been captured by right-wing ideologues who have abandoned even the pretense of protecting voting rights. Critically, gerrymandering in the Lone Star State also created an electoral firewall for Republicans, with 21 of the 25 Texas seats they hold being districts that Donald Trump carried by 15 or more percentage points in 2020. An electoral firewall. They're not even hiding it anymore. They're openly bragging about creating unassailable partisan fortresses where Democratic votes are diluted into meaninglessness. But wait, because the plot thickens and becomes even more deliciously revealing of Republican dysfunction, because what we're seeing in that clip, and what we're seeing in states like Indiana, is that not all Republicans are willing to go along with this scheme, and the reasons are fascinating and complex, and ultimately damning. While the new map easily passed the Indiana House, the top Senate Republican initially declined to convene a special session, saying the votes were not there. The votes weren't there even in a Republican-controlled chamber in a deep red state, because some legislators actually listened to their constituents who overwhelmingly opposed this naked power grab, and because some legislators realized that representing districts that might stretch 150 miles and carve up communities of interest in grotesque fashion would make their jobs as representatives functionally impossible, and because some legislators still possess enough residual shame to recognize that what Trump is demanding is fundamentally incompatible with democratic governance, and this is where the internal Republican Civil War becomes absolutely critical to understanding the broader trajectory of American politics, because what Trump has done is expose the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the modern Republican Party, which is that it simultaneously claims to be the party of constitutional originalism and democratic principles, while actively working to dismantle both. Republicans across the board are increasingly worried about their fate next November, with the party on edge that Trump's redistricting push may be backfiring, awaiting a critical ruling on its Texas maps. And then there's the early December special election in Tennessee, which Republicans are heavily favored to win, but likely with a closer than expected margin, with Democrats now spending heavily in the race. They're worried because they can read polls. They can see that Trump's agenda is catastrophically unpopular. They understand that when you strip healthcare from millions of people, and start deportation campaigns and tank the economy with idiotic tariffs, voters tend to get angry and vote you out, and no amount of gerrymandering can completely overcome a wave election, if that wave is big enough. The historical parallel that keeps screaming in my mind as I watch this unfold is the 2010 Red Map Project, where Republicans executed a brilliantly cynical strategy of winning state legislatures specifically to control the post-census redistricting process. Both parties engaged in gerrymandering after the 2020 census, but overall the bias in this cycle's map strongly favors Republicans due primarily to aggressive gerrymandering in GOP strongholds in the South and Midwest. What's different now is the sheer brazenness, the complete abandonment of even pro forma justifications, the willingness to do it mid-decade, which shatters over a century of precedent, and the direct involvement of a sitting president who is openly demanding that states rig elections in his favor. This isn't politics as usual. This isn't normal partisan maneuvering. This is a frontal assault on the structural foundations of representative democracy, and the fact that we're discussing it in measured analytical terms rather than with the apocalyptic urgency it deserves shows how completely desensitized we've become to democratic backsliding. Let me take you deeper into the mechanics of what makes this so pernicious, because gerrymandering isn't just about winning seats, it's about creating a self-reinforcing cycle of extremism and unaccountability. When you draw districts that are safe for one party, you eliminate competitive general elections, which means the only thing that matters is the primary, and primaries are dominated by the most ideologically extreme and activated voters, which means legislators have every incentive to race to the fringes and zero incentive to compromise or moderate or actually govern effectively, because they face no accountability from the broader electorate. The new maps reshape Democratic Rep. Al Green's Houston district in the rural areas, making a district that was 72% Democratic into one that is 40% Democratic, with the proposed map also changing Rep. Julie Johnson's Dallas area district from 62% to 41% Democratic. You're looking at districts where the entire political geography is being rewritten to eliminate competitive elections and ensure Republican victories regardless of how voters actually feel about Republican governance. And then there's the racial dimension, which cannot be emphasized enough, because what we're witnessing isn't just partisan gerrymandering, it's racial gerrymandering that deliberately dilutes the voting power of Black and Latino communities. The Indiana House held just one hearing on the map Tuesday, where members of the public accused Republicans of introducing a racial gerrymander that divides Marion County, the state's most populous county where the capital of Indianapolis is located, into 4 districts where minority voters won't be able to elect a candidate of their choice, with Marion County having been majority non-white since the last census. They're taking majority-minority districts and slicing them up like a gerrymandered pizza, ensuring that Black and brown voters are submerged in larger white-majority districts where their votes are swamped and their voices silenced. And this is happening with the explicit blessing of a Supreme Court that has systematically gutted the Voting Rights Act and refused to establish any meaningful standards for combating partisan gerrymandering. The Rucho v. Common Cause decision in 2019 was the moment when the Supreme Court essentially threw up its hands and said partisan gerrymandering is a political question, not a justiciable one, which was a cowardly abdication of judicial responsibility that has enabled everything we're seeing now, because it told Republicans that there are no federal constitutional guardrails, no limiting principles, no point at which the courts will step in and say you've gone too far. And Chief Justice Roberts had the audacity to write in that opinion that fixing gerrymandering was the responsibility of state legislatures and voters themselves, which is circular logic so absurd it would be funny if it weren't so tragic, because he's essentially saying that the people whose power depends on gerrymandered maps should voluntarily give up that power, and that voters whose votes have been diluted through gerrymandering should somehow overcome that dilution to elect different legislators who will draw fair maps. It's like telling someone drowning that they should solve their problem by swimming better. Now let's talk about what this means for 2026 and beyond, because the stakes here are genuinely existential for American democracy. Facing increasingly dire polls, President Donald Trump is determined to prevent Democrats from reclaiming the U.S. House in the 2026 midterm elections, so he's pressuring Republican-controlled states to give the GOP an unfair edge by gerrymandering their congressional maps, with Texas, North Carolina, and Missouri having already done so. Trump understands that if Democrats retake the House in 2026, his presidency becomes effectively over, because if Democrats take control of the chamber, they could stymie the president's legislative agenda and launch investigations of his administration. This is about insulating himself from accountability, about creating a permanent Republican majority that can shield him from oversight, and enable his authoritarian impulses, and what makes it even more insidious is that he's framing this as Republicans being entitled to these seats, as if democratic representation is something that can be claimed through executive fiat rather than earned through persuasion and coalition building. The bombshell that should be dominating headlines is that the effort has hit unexpected pushback in Indiana and become a test of Trump's grip on his party. This is the first real crack in Trump's armor since he returned to power, because it demonstrates that there are limits to how far even compliant Republicans will go, that threats and intimidation don't always work, that sometimes the sheer transparent awfulness of what you're being asked to do overwhelms fear of primary challenges, and the fact that this resistance is happening in Indiana of all places, one of the reddest states in the country, suggests that Trump may have finally overreached, that he's pushed too hard too fast, and awakened something in Republican legislators that even they didn't know they still possessed, which is a bare minimum commitment to procedural legitimacy and community representation. But we can't be naive about this because even if the Indiana gerrymander fails, the broader damage is already done because Republicans have more options for redistricting than Democrats, with redistricting being done by state legislatures and Republicans controlling more legislatures around the country than Democrats, while some of the states that Democrats control have legal barriers to partisan gerrymandering, or they have laws requiring that special commissions draw the lines. This structural asymmetry means that Democrats are fighting with one hand tied behind their backs because they've actually passed reforms in states they control that prevent them from gerrymandering as aggressively as Republicans are doing in red states, and this is the classic paradox of Democratic politics, which is that the side committed to democratic norms is always at a disadvantage against the side willing to burn those norms to the ground. What should horrify every person watching this is the cascade effect, because once you normalize mid-decade redistricting, once you establish that presidents can simply demand that states redraw maps whenever electoral conditions become unfavorable, you've eliminated the last remaining constraint on partisan map manipulation. The events that have transpired since have been best characterized as a redistricting arms race that has seen more and more states, including California, Florida, Missouri, and New York, threatening to redistrict in an effort to counter one another. An arms race, that's the perfect metaphor, because just like nuclear weapons, once one side has them, everyone needs them, and suddenly you're in a mutually assured destruction scenario where both parties are racing to gerrymander more aggressively than the other, and the only casualty is democratic legitimacy itself. The Freedom to Vote Act, which Congress came agonizingly close to passing, would have solved this entirely because the Freedom to Vote Act would change this and give federal courts the ability to determine when a gerrymander has gone too far, employing standard quantitative measures of partisan fairness to see if each voter's vote counts equally. But it failed by 2 votes in the Senate because of the filibuster, that archaic anti-democratic relic that allows a minority to block legislation supported by the majority, and now we're living with the consequences, which is a gerrymandering free-for-all, where the only limiting principle is how much backlash politicians are willing to endure. What makes this clip so powerful as a piece of political theater is that it captures in microcosm the entire Republican dilemma, which is that they're trying to execute an authoritarian power grab while maintaining the pretense of democratic legitimacy, and those two things are fundamentally incompatible. You can see it in the rushed adjournment, in the lack of debate, in the obvious desire to get this vote done and move on before anyone has time to think too hard about what just happened, and that tells you everything about their consciousness of guilt, their awareness that what they're doing is indefensible, and their calculation that speed and obfuscation are their only options because defending this on the merits would be impossible. And here's where we need to connect this to the broader authoritarian playbook, because what Trump is doing follows a very specific pattern that we've seen in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in Venezuela, where would-be autocrats don't typically seize power through military coups. They do it through 1,000 paper cuts to democratic institutions, through stacking courts and changing election rules, and gerrymandering districts, and controlling media, and delegitimizing opposition, and each individual action can be spun as normal politics or defensive measures, but the cumulative effect is the hollowing out of democracy, until all that remains is the empty shell. By attempting to bolster his party's odds of winning midterm elections, and keep control of Congress, President Trump is attempting to circumvent the will of voters by eliminating the accountability elections bring, which is in turn a core element of democracy. He's not trying to win elections. He's trying to eliminate elections as a meaningful form of accountability. The response from voters should be overwhelming rage because what Republican legislators are doing in these chambers is fundamentally about stripping you of your power, about making your vote meaningless, about ensuring that no matter how unpopular their policies become, they remain in power. An overwhelming majority of Americans oppose partisan gerrymandering because it leaves all citizens worse off by sowing extreme division, undermining equal representation, and boosting the influence of powerful special interests, with the Redistricting Reform Act being a crucial step toward achieving a vision of putting the nation back on the path toward true democracy, where every state is required to have independent commissions draw the maps instead of power-hungry politicians, and every state is held to the same standards to achieve fair maps. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. The fact that it has become one tells you everything about how completely the Republican Party has abandoned any pretense of commitment to democratic principles. Now let me hit you with the really frightening part, because what happens if Republicans succeed in gerrymandering themselves into an unassailable House majority for 2026? What happens when Trump realizes that he can govern without accountability, that he can push through any policy no matter how unpopular, that investigations into his corruption will never happen, that impeachment is off the table permanently? We've already seen glimpses of his authoritarian instincts in his first term, and those were constrained by divided government and the threat of electoral consequences, but remove those constraints and you're looking at a qualitatively different kind of presidency, one where the normal push and pull of democratic politics becomes vestigial and irrelevant. Just a little over a week after Newsom's counter-redistricting announcement, President Trump stated he had further plans to undermine free and fair elections by banning the widely used practice of mail-in voting. Banning mail-in voting. He's not even being subtle about it anymore. The thing that should keep you up at night is that gerrymandering doesn't just affect congressional elections, it affects state legislatures, which control everything from education funding to healthcare access to criminal justice policy to environmental regulations. And when you have gerrymandered state legislatures passing gerrymandered congressional maps, you've created a self-perpetuating cycle where democratic accountability becomes virtually impossible to restore. Gerrymandering directly affects how communities are represented at every level of government, from local councils and state legislatures to the U.S. House of Representatives, with these elected bodies making decisions that shape our daily lives, including public education, healthcare access, and transportation. And when district lines are manipulated for political gain, it can dilute the power of voters, making it harder for communities to elect leaders who truly reflect their needs and priorities. This is about power over every dimension of your life, and Republicans are claiming that power regardless of whether voters actually want them to have it. And let's be absolutely clear about the racism at the heart of this, because it's not coincidental that the districts being carved up are majority-minority districts. It's not accidental that opponents argue that the new map dilutes the voting power of black residents in eastern North Carolina. This is the old Southern strategy updated for the 21st century, the same white supremacist logic that undergirded Jim Crow voter suppression dressed up in the language of partisan advantage, and the fact that Republican legislators can look themselves in the mirror and claim they're the party of Lincoln, while systematically disempowering black and brown voters, is moral hypocrisy of such breathtaking magnitude that it would be impressive if it weren't so nauseating. What you're watching in this clip isn't just a procedural vote, it's a civilizational choice between democracy and authoritarianism, between a system where voters choose their representatives and a system where representatives choose their voters, between a republic that derives its legitimacy from popular sovereignty and a performative democracy where elections happen but outcomes are predetermined. And the fact that this choice is being made in rushed voice votes followed by immediate adjournments tells you that Republican legislators understand exactly what they're doing and exactly how indefensible it is. So what do we do? Because outrage without action is just performance, and we need concrete strategies for fighting back. First, we need to understand that this is a multi-front war that requires simultaneous pressure on courts, state legislatures, Congress, and in the streets. We need to support litigation challenging these maps as racial gerrymanders, because even though the Supreme Court has abdicated its responsibility, some lower courts and state courts are still willing to enforce voting rights protections. We need to mobilize voters in 2026 to overcome the gerrymander through sheer turnout, because while gerrymandering creates advantages, it can't completely override massive wave elections. We need to demand that Democrats in states they control either pass independent redistricting reform or fight fire with fire and gerrymander just as aggressively as Republicans, because unilateral disarmament in this context is political suicide. And most importantly, we need to make this a voting issue. We need to ensure that every voter understands that when they cast a ballot, they're not just choosing representatives, they're choosing whether we remain a democracy or descend into competitive authoritarianism. The lesson of this moment is that democracy doesn't die in darkness. It dies in full view of everyone through 1,000 procedural votes that individually seem boring and technical, but collectively represent the dismantling of popular sovereignty. What you just watched matters infinitely more than most viral moments, because it's a window into how power actually works, how democratic backsliding actually happens, how authoritarianism establishes itself, not through dramatic confrontations, but through the patient accumulation of structural advantages that make opposition increasingly futile. And if we don't recognize this moment for what it is, if we don't fight back with everything we have, if we allow Republicans to successfully gerrymander themselves into permanent power, then we will look back on clips like this and realize we were watching democracy die in real time, and we didn't even notice until it was too late. This is the fight of our generation, and it's happening right now, in state legislative chambers and courtrooms and congressional offices, and the outcome will determine whether our children inherit a functioning democracy or a hollow shell where voting is a ritual but power is predetermined, and the only question is whether we're willing to fight with the urgency but intensity this moment demands.